Awesome. Um, Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm super excited to talk a little bit about my best friends, the burrowing crayfish. Quick introduction about myself. This is me in my professional capacity at University of Illinois. I'm a teaching assistant professor. I teach mostly about wetland science and wetland conservation. But that kind of ties in really nicely to my unprofessional life where I'm looking a little more like this, constantly in the dirt looking for burrowing crayfish. So that's what I'm here to chat to you all about today. So crayfish, crawdads, crawfish, yabbies, freshwater lobsters, mudbugs, all terms that refer to the same animal. The term crayfish, the name crayfish, actually comes from the old French word écrevisse, or escrevisse in older French, which then just through kind of folk etymology got turned to crayfish. And there's over 600 species of them worldwide. Crayfish are way more diverse than people usually realize. And they are the closest relatives to lobsters. Makes sense if you look at them. They're also pretty closely related to shrimp. And the big thing that kind of relates those three groups is that they have 10 legs. That's how you know it's a crayfish if it's freshwater with big front claws and 10 legs, including those big front claws or chelae. And as I said, crayfish are super diverse. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. This is the smallest crayfish in the United States. It is Cambarellus diminutus, or the least crayfish, and it's a member of this Cambarellus genus of swamp crayfishes. So this is the tip of my finger with the crayfish specimen on it, and this is actually a full adult female. You can see in this circle on the right that she has a full clutch of eggs. And at only 12 millimeters of body length, she's fully adult and reproducing at this point. Way on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Tasmanian giant crayfish, Astacopsis gouldi. It's also called the Tasmanian giant freshwater lobster, and it's the largest freshwater invertebrate in the world. Largest crayfish species, but largest freshwater invertebrate overall. Super long lived is thought to survive for up to 60 years, can weigh up to like 13 pounds, the size of like a pretty chunky cat, and can be over 31 inches long. So completely other end of the spectrum than the dwarf crayfishes. It's so big that whenever it is fully mature, there's no natural predators due to its large size. So it's found in Tasmania, and it is currently listed as an endangered species because of overfishing and habitat degradation. So generally, if you wanted to see this species, you'd have to book the one or two people that are able to take you on an ecotourism tour to go catch and see it. It's not one that you'll really encounter in the wild on your own. So crazy amount of sizes, also a lot of diversity of shapes and morphology that can be presented in crayfish. So on the left here, I've got a specimen of the Madagascar brown crayfish that was in the Smithsonian Museum. And it is part of this genus Astacoides, which is entirely endemic to Madagascar. They're not found anywhere else. And even within Madagascar, they're only found on a pretty small area of the island, mostly kind of undisturbed areas. But their nearest relatives are over in Oceania because there's actually no native crayfish to mainland Africa or India. So zooming the whole way to the other side of the ocean on the Australian side with the Murray crayfish on the right, and you can see these kind of crazy spines it has all over its body. Same with these crazy spines all along the edge of the Madagascar crayfish. We don't even really know what the purpose of having those kind of spines are, but it's a really interesting morphology. And these guys also, since they're so closely related to the Madagascar crayfish, get pretty large in size, up to about 4.5 pounds in weight. They are the second largest of the freshwater crayfishes behind that Tasmanian giant crayfish. I actually saw a really wonderful presentation by Jim Firse, who is an Australian crayfish researcher, and he had footage of these guys right here stealing chicken eggs off of farms. So, you know, a lot of the time we think of the crayfish in the States as being a lot smaller, but crayfish around the world can be really, really massive. And here's kind of a brief look of the diversity that we have here in the United States. So here's our Cambarellus. These are our dwarf crayfishes right beside our Barbicambaris, which is the biggest group that we have in the United States. They're found down South Tennessee, North Alabama. You know, we've got other things like our Orconectes. These are our cave-dwelling crayfish, and they actually have evolved to not have eyes anymore, because what use is it down there? But you can see just how diverse the colors and the patterns and even the body shapes within this. Faxonius is the kind of the stream-dwelling genus. They have really kind of round bullet-shaped bodies all the way to these skinny, long noses or rostrums, big bug eyes. There's a lot of diversity in what we're seeing here in the United States. And we're really lucky because in North America, we actually have 2/3 of the global diversity. So it's a really perfect place for crayfish researchers to come and study. So I'm here mostly to talk about burrowing crayfish. All crayfish, to an extent, can do some burrowing. So if you walk past like a shallow water area, you might see something like this, just plain holes in the bottom. That's probably where this water has dried down and the crayfish needed some sort of shelter to avoid the drought. Or something like this, where this is a stream-dwelling crayfish that can just kind of shuffle under some rocks and create an incredibly shallow burrow. That's not really what I'm talking about when I say burrowing crayfish. There are some crayfish that rely on burrows for significant periods of their life. So this is a diagram here that, I'll smooth that this way. This is a diagram here that shows the different types of burrows that you might see from burrowing crayfish. So those ones that I was just showing images of, we'd consider them tertiary burrowers, or not really true burrowers. They just create these kind of shallow burrows beneath rocks and call it a day. We also have secondary burrowers. Now they have a lot of variation in the kind of burrows that they can make. Some of them have these long tunnels all the way to the groundwater. Some of them will have long tunnels, but still an entrance into some sort of permanent water body. And they'll move in and out of that permanent water body a lot more regularly. That's what makes them secondary burrowers. They can spend time in their burrows, but a lot of the time they're still in open water. And then my favorite guys, the ones that I research the most, are the primary burrowers. Now, these are crayfish that will spend most of their lives in the burrows that they create. So they can have multiple entrances, multiple tunnels, usually coming down to a chamber, this larger open area at the groundwater table. And that's how they'll keep their gills moist, because they are still aquatic animals, they have gills. But as long as their gills stay moist, as long as the atmosphere is humid, they can actually breathe in the open air for several days. And then a lot of the time, this tunnel will carry on deeper and they will continue excavating that as the groundwater fluctuates up and down throughout the year. They'll always kind of stay in tune with those groundwater levels. So when I'm out searching for my true burrowing crayfish, my primary burrowers, this is kind of what I would be looking for. And this is maybe something that you would see in your local park or wetland, or even in your yard if you live somewhat close to a stream. These are called chimneys. And it's basically where, as crayfish were excavating their burrows, they pull all of the mud using their bodies, holding it to themselves with their claws, the whole way up the tunnel and push it out over the top. And some of them will make these beautiful, very neat burrows, these perfect little kind of soil pebbles. And if the soil's a lot wetter, a lot clay heavier, sometimes they don't make as neat a burrow. You might just be looking for like a pile of fresh mud that's been pushed out the top. So there's a lot of variation in what you can see in terms of a chimney. But if you see a chimney, if you see some indication of recent activity, that's a great sign that that burrow has a crayfish in it and not some other animal that you're maybe not trying to find. As to why they build these chimneys, there's some evidence that the chimneys improve airflow through the tunnels underground. It's quite an anoxic environment down there, so the chimneys maybe funnel air. There's also some thoughts that they maybe put kind of pheromones or urine on the mud pellets as they're rolling them out, and that's an indicator of who's in the neighborhood, if they're looking for mates or if they're looking to live near their closest relatives. That's a good indicator of where they should set up their burrows. It's a safe area. So true burrowers will spend the majority of their lives underground beneath these chimneys. They might come out occasionally to forage or to find mates, or if it rains very heavily and they don't want to be flooded out in their anoxic burrows. But most of the time they are down there sheltering, excavating, keeping track of that groundwater so they have moisture. And they don't, as far just anecdotally, as I've seen, they don't seem to stop building those burrows at any point. They are constantly excavating, constantly making new tunnels. They're very industrious little mud bugs. They will even breed down there in the burrows. So the female crayfish will have these eggs that she keeps attached underneath her tail. She'll like fold her tail under and carry them on her body. And those eggs will hatch while still attached to her tail and release what's called instars. So the big difference, even though they're kind of sister taxa between crayfish and lobsters, apart from the freshwater saltwater divide, is that crayfish have what's called direct development. So while lobsters have a larval stage in the ocean, crayfish don't ever have a larval stage. Once those instars drop off and become free living juveniles, they just look like tiny versions of crayfish, and they will molt multiple times in their first year as they get bigger and look like a crayfish the whole time. So this is just one tiny crayfish that I caught down in Texas right after breeding season. Tiny, but you can tell it's a crayfish. And here's a video on the other side, looking down into a burrow. The red is a couple crayfish right here, a couple juveniles. And as I zoom into the water, you can just see that wriggling, writhing of all of the juveniles. Here's some legs sticking out the side. Some of them are trying to burrow their own tunnels out the side of this parental burrow. And basically, once they drop off the mother, become free living, it's time to get out of that burrow. If they stick around too long, then they become snacks. So here's kind of a national distribution of burrowing crayfish in the United States. And you can see, like all other aquatic animals, this down here in the southeast is where you're going to have the highest biodiversity. Mussels, fish, everything aquatic has the highest biodiversity down in the southeast since the glaciation. But you can see also some really big gaps. And it's really unlikely that there's no burrowing crayfish here in Iowa. It's way more likely that there's just not been any dedicated survey efforts in Iowa to see what's living there. And there's some really big gaps all around the place. So why don't more people study burrowing crayfish? Because it's really hard, because it's a really hard group of animals to research. This is a plastic PVC quadrat in a prairie from where I was surveying for crayfish, and I've cleared out as much of the grass as possible. And believe it or not, there is a burrow in this picture right there. So they're really hard to spot. Detection can be difficult, especially if they're living in areas with dense vegetation. And then even once you've spotted them, they're really difficult to get out of the ground. People have tried a lot of different things. You know, I'm always asked why I don't just stick a hot dog on a string and put it down there and see if I can tempt a crayfish out. But there's been a lot of studies on like the best methods to catch them. And consistently the highest success rate, if you want to get your hands on a decent number of crayfish, if you're doing population surveys or anything like that, you're gonna have to dig them up with your bare hands. And that literally involves finding one of those active burrows, something with a chimney, opening up the tunnel and sticking your arm down there and hoping that you can feel a crayfish. And those burrows can go really deep into the ground, and they don't necessarily live where the groundwater is right at the surface. So here's an example on the right of me digging in a graveyard in Arkansas, attempting to get my hands on some of them. We did not dig on any graves, but there were burrows on several of the graves, and it has led to crayfish having the nickname coffin crackers because they will be there. But despite it being hard, we are having a massive uptick in interest on burrowing crayfish. There's become more funding opportunities. There are more people doing theses and degrees on crayfish, and a lot more interest in these burrowing crayfish for really, really good reason. They are actually very important to the environment. They're really critical for maintaining effective food webs. So there's kind of a common saying that everything eats crayfish. And it's kind of true. There's over 200 species that have been recorded feeding on crayfish just in the United States. And around 100 of those are terrestrial vertebrates. So it's not just, you know, largemouth bass that feed on crayfish. It's not just sport fish that we're interested in. Things like otters are feeding on them, raccoons are feeding on them. They're really good at maintaining both aquatic and terrestrial food webs, especially those burrowers that might be out after a rain and become really easy pickings for any small mammals that are out and about. They also provide habitat for a bunch of other species by making those burrows. So up here on the left, I've got the crawfish frog. He is often a species that uses those crayfish burrows to provide some habitat or shelter. And there's nothing more alarming when you're digging up a crayfish burrow than expecting to be touching a hard carapace, the hard shell of a crayfish, and you touch something that's kind of squishy instead, really freaks you out. But it's great that the frogs are using the burrows and they're providing that additional assistance to other biodiversity. Down here, we have the Hines emerald dragonfly. So this is a federally endangered species. And some researchers discovered that the larval stage of the Hines emerald dragonfly actually relies on crayfish burrows because crayfish dig to the water table. So whenever those prairies dry out and they don't have access to any sort of surface water, the larval stages will chance their luck in the burrow with a crayfish rather than just desiccate outside. So crayfish are considered really important for maintaining that federally endangered species. And then up here on the right, I've got, I think this is a queen snake, but it's part of the Regina genera of snakes. And they are a genus of snakes that entirely rely on crayfish as their main food source. So they are constantly in and out of burrows looking for food. The Massasaugas, which are also endangered, also overwinter in those crayfish burrows because the temperature is a lot more stable if you're deeper underground. So a ton of biodiversity. We're actually doing some research right now, taking soil samples to look for DNA that's been left behind by other animals, and trying to pull the water out of the burrows to see what macroinvertebrates might be living down there. We're trying to make more of a dedicated effort to survey what is living in the burrows beyond just the crayfish. One really, really cool one that I just had when I was in Arkansas last month is this guy. This is a mole cricket, and you can see they have those kind of stocky front legs that they use to burrow. It's burrowing right through fingers here as it's being held. So these guys are thought to typically create their own burrows, but this is one that we found using a crayfish burrow. So you never know what kind of biodiversity crayfish are supporting on the landscape. And then finally, by making those burrows, again, it's not just habitat, they're actually helping the plant life as well. They mix a lot of the soil in pulling those deeper soil layers up to the surface. They help aerate the soil. They pull nutrients that's getting lost to the deeper soil layers back to the surface where it's more accessible. And they can overall just improve the water flow that's happening through those top layers of soil. And I'm saying like deeper soil layers, burrows have been shown to be up to 5 meters deep. So that's enormous, like 15 feet down there underground. And studies have tried to quantify how much soil will be moved by crayfish. And we don't necessarily have an exact number, but estimates say that literally tons of soil will be moved over the course of a year by one burrowing crayfish population. So where are these burrows? Where do they live? You know, they live in a variety of places. As I mentioned, they might come out of their burrows for food or to find mates, so you will occasionally, especially in the summer, find them in streams and lakes and ponds if you're just out doing regular like dip nets or aquatic surveys. But when they're in the burrows, you'll find them in wetlands, you'll find them in prairies, and you'll find them in roadside ditches, my favorite place to sample, usually full of trash and broken glass, but we do it for the crayfish. And these roadside ditches really throw people off because, you're trying to gain concern about species that might be threatened, or you're trying to claim that they don't have enough habitat, and yet they're living in what people think of as kind of trash environments. But roadside ditches, I personally think, are a really undervalued habitat because they have access to ephemeral water. They flood seasonally. They get somewhat regular disturbance in the form of being mowed or burned, but nothing to the level of agriculture where the soil is actually being tilled. So all of this kind of semi-regular disturbance, access to seasonal water, I think really makes them closer to a remnant wetland and a remnant prairie than it does to just a human anthropogenic environment. I think that they're really undervalued. And there's several other species that rely on them as well. Things like pocket gophers really rely on these roadside ditches. The culverts provide really important habitat for migratory bats. So I think people are really underestimating how great these roadside ditches are for biodiversity. And I've done a bit of research attempting to figure out where they live, what's influencing them, why they've chosen this spot. One of the things I looked at was prairies because, this tiny aquatic invertebrate surely isn't going to respond especially well to prairies that are being regularly burned. So I did this study in Missouri where we looked at a prairie near Mexico, Missouri. And this is it after 2 years of not burning, all of those warm season grasses are really grown up versus right after it had been burned a couple weeks before this image was taken. You can see those cool season grasses, the greens have really colonized the area quickly. And we actually didn't find any difference in burrow abundance or burrow density between these burned areas. We sampled over a couple of years so that we could burn different sites and see if it was having an impact. And we found that the crayfish didn't really seem to mind. What we noticed was that we were sampling the prairie crayfish and it was digging extremely deep burrows. I think the deepest we managed to dig was about 6 feet down, fully putting another human under the ground, feet sticking up. To try and catch some of these guys. They were digging extremely deep, which I think is probably a response to the burn to avoid the heat. But what they cared most about was actually the installation of some artificial ponds. So the Missouri Department of Conservation had put some ponds in with no fish to provide a breeding habitat for amphibians where their eggs wouldn't be eaten. And that probably raises the groundwater level, makes easier digging, and that's around that areas where we were finding the highest number of crayfish. I did another study on wetland management where we were comparing 3 types, just kind of regularly maintained, just mowed, but not really disturbed other than that. We looked at areas that were disked for conservation as opposed to agriculture. So they turned over the soil, but it doesn't go as deep as if you wanted to crop the land. And then unmanaged areas, which in the floodplain of Missouri tend to grow up as these bottomland kind of swampy forests. And we actually found the highest densities of crayfish here in these managed areas. So they do seem to like a little bit of disturbance. They were still found in the unmanaged areas, but in much smaller densities, much smaller abundances. And basically we think that it has to do with the canopy cover. This seems to be consistently discovered with multiple species of crayfish. Where the canopy cover gets really dense, you won't find them. And we don't have a perfect reason as to why that is. It could be because higher canopy cover means higher chance of predation. It could be that some of those trees that are providing the canopy cover have deep roots and that lowers the water table or makes it really difficult to dig. Haven't fully figured it out yet, but that's my career. So they are pretty tolerant of this disturbance. They live in a wide variety of habitats. but they're still threatened species. As I mentioned, there's 600 species worldwide. About a third of those are threatened with extinction. Another fifth of those don't have enough data on them to actually evaluate their conservation status. So this is all crayfish, not just burrowing crayfish. Here in the United States, we've got 6 species of, or sorry, I should update this. It's now 8 species of crayfish that are federally protected, and 241 species that have some level of state protection. So this huge kind of discordance between species that are being federally recognized and species that at the state level we know need support. And currently there are no burrowing crayfish listed under the Endangered Species Act. I'm currently working to try and get one of them listed in Arkansas, but there are crayfish, burrowing crayfish, where their entire known range is the roadside ditches of one highway, and they're still not listed because we just don't have enough information to evaluate them and decide, justify that they deserve that listing. And a lot of the threats that apply specifically to burrowing crayfish are things like damming or groundwater extraction, especially with the interest in mining for more rare earth elements. As America is becoming moving to become more energy self-sufficient, those mining activities require a lot of groundwater extraction, really lowering the water table, which is the primary thing that these burrowing crayfish are relying on. Pollution, also a huge issue for all aquatic species. Invasive species is a real concern, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And urban development is a really big one. So actually habitat loss for these species. They live in wetlands, they live in prairies, the 2 ecosystems that have been removed from the landscape the most, degraded the most in the United States. They're kind of relegated to these remnant roadside ditch areas, and even then they're not safe. So this is a site on the right here that I was at in Arkansas last month, and it is a really narrowly endemic species that's supposed to live here. I think it has like 10 known locations in the whole state. That's its entire range, and this was a site that 10 years ago had been confirmed to hold it. But since it had been visited, they'd put in new drainage structures, kind of this impermeable surface that allows the water to just flow straight into the stream, doesn't get to soak into the roadside ditch, and the crayfish were totally gone. Not a single burrow to be found in this area. But it's not all bad. We are trying, we are doing our best. The small number of us that study burrowing crayfish are working on what we can do to help them. And especially these roadside ditches that have become such important habitat for them, they're really under threat when departments of transportation want to widen highways, because it will just get paved over and they will lose that ditch habitat. So we've actually started researching how to translocate crayfish. As I mentioned, a lot of them are not, all of them have no federal protection. So there's not really any reason why the departments of transportation should not widen the highways. There's no legal requirement, but we've been working with Arkansas Department of Transportation, who are actually really excited to work with us. They've been really responsive, and they're letting us know where they're planning to expand some of those highways so that we can try and remove the crayfish beforehand. They've also donated an old rest area that's been kind of re-landscaped into a potentially suitable ditch, and we are practicing translocations over there to see what exactly we need to do to maximize survival. So we've been making these pseudo burrows, these fake burrows just with like an iron post into the ground to the groundwater. And we've been testing if crayfish will move into them and will survive. So that's a pretty exciting project. And so far, seems to be going pretty well. They seem to be appreciating their new burrows. So stay tuned on that. That's a project over the next couple of years. So what do y'all have in Wisconsin? You have got 3 species of burrowing crayfish known right now. There haven't been a ton of burrowing crayfish dedicated surveys in the state of Wisconsin, so it's possible that there are other species that just haven't been discovered there, or that there are new species that haven't ever been described. The first one here is the prairie crayfish. This is one of my favorites. I think they're really fun. They're also incredibly difficult to catch because they can dig so deep into the ground. But this is your only burrowing crayfish in Wisconsin that's like a state species of concern. It's thought to be restricted to prairie regions in the southeast of Wisconsin, but I think we've got a couple other records up near Milwaukee and a couple over on the western side of Wisconsin as well. But this is, out of all of them, burrowing and not burrowing, the rarest crayfish in the state right now. And you can see it comes generally in kind of a brownish red color. Sometimes I'll see these kind of blue or purple dots right at the bottom of this movable finger on its claw. And the best way, if you want to identify it, is looking on the edge of the claw, and these tubercles or little bumps on the side of the claw will be really, really spiky. So if you've got like a brownish red crayfish, maybe has a little blue dot on the hand and has these really spiky tubercles, you've probably got yourself a prairie crayfish. And they're really fun whenever you do get your hands on them. They're not very excited about it. Burrowing crayfish are generally considered less aggressive than stream-dwelling crayfish, but I've still encountered plenty of aggressive ones. Second species that you have is the digger crayfish. This comes in a lot of different colors. Sometimes it can be really pale, sometimes it's kind of speckled. A lot of the time it just looks olivey green or brown. And this is actually the most common burrowing crayfish in the United States. It has a range of over 1 million square kilometers across, and it moves the whole way into Canada, the whole way down into Texas. It is also probably a species complex that a few people are working on, and the rest of the folks are kind of ignoring it because it makes it a lot harder to identify. But it will probably get split into several different species. So this may not be the digger crayfish in the future, but for now, that's where we're at. And the way, apart from all of its different color variations, that I think is the easiest to identify it is if you look at the claw, it's got this deep notch right in the claw, this deep kind of semicircle curve. And then right at the bottom of those two fingers is usually really furry. Here's another example of that deep, deep notch. Kind of a little bit of hair right here. You can see it's kind of spiky, but isn't as spiky as the digger crayfish. And this is an example of what it can look like when it's got kind of a paler speckled color. And a lot of the smaller ones will look like this, probably because it's better for camouflage. And the last species you have is the Great Plains mudbug, Lacunicambarus nebraskaensis. So this one you will probably see in the books listed as the devil crayfish. Devil crayfish was also a species complex, got split out into lots of different species, and right now this is what we think that you have. So a lot of the time it's got these gorgeous red hints around the rostrum, around the claw, down to the tip of the fingers. Has very smooth, flat tubercles along the edge, not spiky like that like the prairie crayfish, and doesn't have a big heavy notch like the digger crayfish. So if it doesn't have the other two defining features and it's got nice red color on it, you've probably got yourself a Great Plains mudbug. Now, I don't know if you want to go through IDing all the crayfish that you ever find, but you can look really simply and just decide, is it a burrower? Is it likely to be one of those three? You can look on the back of the crayfish at this area that's called the areola. And if these two, this is kind of where the gills are kept in the crayfish. If these two lines touch, that's how you know that it is a burrowing crayfish. We think it's because they need a bigger kind of area to keep their gills in because the water underground doesn't have as much oxygen in it. Whereas this is a stream-dwelling crayfish, specifically the rusty that is invasive in Wisconsin. It's got more of a gap between the two gill pouches. So if you see a gap, you know that you've got a stream crayfish. If the lines touch, you've got a burrowing crayfish. The only one that might throw you off is everyone's favorite, the red swamp crayfish. So this is the one that everyone eats at crawfish boils. It also will have lines that touch. It can make burrows, and it's kind of contentious in the crayfish world if you consider this a true burrower or not. I consider it a true burrower because of some of the burrows I've had to dig to get it out of the ground have been pretty impressive. But some people will say it's a stream-dwelling crayfish because they are really common in lakes and ponds as well. They spend a lot of time in open water bodies. So this is the only one that might throw you off if you catch it in a river. Last one I wanted to mention is the marmor crab's crayfish or the marbled crayfish. This isn't a burrower. I just wanted to mention while I've got a group of nature-minded individuals, this is actually a really interesting but worrisome crayfish that came out of the German aquarium trade in the 90s, and it's actually evolved to be parthenogenic. So it's the only known decapod crustacean that reproduces through self-cloning. All of the individuals are female. They can lay up to around 700 eggs, and those will develop into genetically identical offspring. So they're a real concern. They are spreading in places like Madagascar, threatening that Madagascar crayfish. They are spreading around Europe. Um, and they were found for the first time in 2023 in Burlington, Ontario, up in Canada. So it's the first wild collection in North America. It hasn't been collected anywhere else in the wild, but it's something we are just warning everyone. If you find it, contact your Department of Natural Resources or contact us. Let someone know that you think you found it. And it's got this really obvious marbled pattern, really skinny claws. You will probably know it when you find it. So if you're interested going out looking for your local crayfish, we actually have a recent website that got published, The World of Crayfish. It's this web platform that we're hosting distributional data for crayfish and the crayfish plague that is associated with them over in Europe. There's over 100,000 records on it. It's a pretty cool effort between myself and over 100 other researchers around the world. And this is an example of what it looks like. If you don't have an account, you can still look at the ranges of species. They come up in these kind of honeycomb style to just show you roughly where it is. So this is an example of that digger crayfish range that is so enormous. These are all spots that it's been found in. And the reason for that is because we are always a little concerned about the pet trade, spreading species, creating invasive species issues. We don't tell people the exact pinpoint location of where to find crayfish. But if you're working on a really specific project and you want to know, you can apply for a free account with this website. You just have to put in a reason why you need to know the exact locations, and then you can log in and you'll be given the exact areas that these species have been found. So that is one way if you want to go to exactly where a crayfish has been found. Or just go outside to your local wetland after a good rain, and those crayfish will come up and you'll just find them. Oh, turn off the sound. You'll just find them walking around. They're not particularly good at walking around, but they will do it. And that's always pretty fun to find one on the path at your local park. So here's my email address. If you've got other questions, if you've got things that you find interesting, send me photographs of what you find. Tell me if you spot burrows. Distributional information is so critical, and it's a big thing that we're really missing from a lot of crayfish studies. And if you have something in mind, let's do a crayfish project together. I haven't worked up in Wisconsin, but I'd be really excited to get up there and start doing some more surveys and see who's living there. So with that, I will turn it over. Oh, I'll just mention, this is one of the coolest species we have in Kentucky. It's called the Crawzilla crawdad, and it's absolutely massive. So with that, I'll turn it over to any questions.